What if Julius Caesar had never crossed the Rubicon? What if Joan of Arc had never heard those haunting voices? What if a young Corsican named Napoleon had never stepped foot in military school? These moments weren't just choices. They were turning points that could have altered the fate of entire nations forever. Today, we dive deep into a story shaped by such irreversible decisions. A saga where every move rippled through history with devastating intensity, forging the France we know and the Europe it changed. But before France rose, what forces were at play in the dense, shadowed forests of Gaul? The stage was set for something colossal, and the tension was about to explode. Friends, be sure to subscribe to my Quiet History channel, like it, and leave a comment of at least 7 words. This is necessary for the channel to function. Share this video with others if you think it's important. Thank you. Before the name France echoed across continents, there was Gaul, a wild, tangled land ruled not by kings, but by tribes. These were not primitive savages, as myths would have you believe, but a mosaic of fiercely independent Celtic peoples: the Belgae, the Aedui, the Arverni, the Sequani. Each tribe spoke its own dialect, worshipped mysterious gods in sacred oak groves, and lived by laws older than Rome itself. Trade and warfare intertwined, alliances forged and broken in blood and fire. This was a world teetering on the brink of monumental change, where the fate of civilizations hung in the balance. Imagine cities tensely perched behind massive walls. Oppida, the bustling centers of commerce and craft. These were not mere settlements. They were fortresses of culture and power. The Gauls minted their own coins, exchanged goods with distant Greek colonies along the Mediterranean, and sculpted art that still captivates us today with its elegance and ferocity. Yet beneath this cultivated surface lay a volatile society, where every handshake could turn into a dagger in the night. The question burned fiercely: who would rise to unite these fractious tribes into a single force, and at what cost? At the heart of this brutal world stood the Druids, keepers of arcane wisdom, judges, healers, and astronomers. Trained for 2 decades, they committed thousands of sacred verses to memory, preserving laws and histories that were never written down. Their knowledge was power, shrouded in mystery, a fragile thread linking past, present, and future. This oral tradition gave the Druids immense influence, but also made them targets in the shadow wars to come. What secrets did they hold that could shape or shatter the destiny of Gaul? Beside these spiritual leaders stood the warrior aristocracy, mounted fighters commanding lands and men, their authority built on wealth, generosity, and blood-soaked valor. These were the men who led tribes into battle, their bodies painted blue, wielding swords and spears carved with exquisite detail. Their presence alone struck terror into enemies, a living force of nature carved from the very forests they called home. Yet, for all their might, they too were vulnerable to the shifting tides of power, and the rise of Rome loomed like a dark storm on the horizon. Beneath the warriors and druids, the backbone of Gaul was formed by farmers and craftsmen, ordinary men and women who toiled the land and forged the weapons of war. Their lives were the pulse of the society, their labor both the foundation and the fuel of a civilization hurtling toward upheaval. Every decision made by the elite echoed down to these humble hands, binding them to a future none could fully grasp, and none could escape. So how did fragmented tribes become a mighty empire? How did a land of forest-dwelling communities transform into the cradle of art, culture, and science? History is not just about kings or emperors, though they played their parts. It's about the shifting fabric of society itself, how power slipped between classes, how religion fused with politics, how revolutions and wars set off chains of consequences still felt today. Each choice, each battle, each voice added a thread to the vast, tangled tapestry of France's destiny. And at the center of it all stood figures like Caesar, Joan, and Napoleon, giants whose decisions echoed through centuries. Napoleon conquered nearly all of Europe, only to lose it all on the frozen plains of Russia. Joan's voices sparked a revolution that saved a nation. Caesar's Rubicon crossing shattered an old world and birthed a new empire. Their stories are not mere legends, but warnings etched in time. One man's choice can rewrite the fate of millions. The question remains, what if those choices had never been made? This journey through history is more than a tale of kings and conquests. It's a story about fear, ambition, and the human will to shape destiny. The land that would become France was forged in blood and fire, in whispers of ancient wisdom and the clash of swords. As we unravel this epic saga, remember, every moment was a precipice, every decision a gamble with eternity. And the echoes of those gambles still resonate in the world we live in today. If you want to continue exploring these turning points and meet the people behind history's most fateful choices, subscribe to Quiet History. Join us as we uncover the tangled web of events that shape not just a nation, but a world on the edge of transformation. The story of France is far from over. Its shadows stretch deep, and its lessons are as urgent now as ever. What drives a civilization to rise and fall? How do decisions echo through centuries, shaping destinies in ways no one foresaw? The story of the Gauls is not just one of warriors and battles, but of innovation, faith, and irreversible choices that charted the course of their world. Their mastery over land and metal was unmatched, yet the shadow of Rome loomed, waiting to alter everything. The Gauls transformed the harsh soils of northern Europe with inventions like the heavy plow, a tool that conquered the earth itself. They crafted harvesting machines and barrels to store their precious wine, innovations that fueled their economy and culture. Their metalworking skills dazzled even the Romans, who adopted Gaulish techniques to forge chainmail and battle helmets, symbols of power and protection. But what would happen when their secrets met the relentless ambitions of Rome? Their religion was woven deeply into the fabric of nature itself, a pantheon of gods embodying war, vegetation, thunder, and the forest's mysteries. Tutates, the war god, Isis, the spirit of the land, Tyrannus, lord of thunder, and Cernunnos, the horned protector of forests and fertility. Sacred groves stood as sanctuaries where rituals unfolded beneath the ancient oaks. Trees held sacred, their mistletoe believed to heal and guard against dark magic. Yet, even amid such reverence, shadows lurked. Human sacrifices were rare but terrifying acts reserved for war or catastrophe. How would these rites shape their fate? Archaeologists now uncover swords, shields, and ritual vessels preserved in the peat bogs of France and Britain, silent witnesses to forgotten ceremonies. These relics speak louder than any written word, for the Gauls left none of their own records. Instead, the stories we have come from Greek and Roman accounts, often distorted, painting the Gauls as savage brutes needing Rome's civilizing hand. But was this the whole truth? The material culture of the Gauls tells a different story, one of exquisite artistry and craftsmanship. Their jewelry, weapons, pottery, and coins reveal a society rich in skill and creativity. Particularly striking was Gallic metallurgy. Blacksmiths and casters forged stunning fibulae, enamel-decorated clasps, massive torques, bronze buckets adorned with intricate reliefs. Their mastery of alloys, casting, and forging astonished even the Romans, who envied their secret techniques. What price would their brilliance pay in the coming storm? Their homes mirrored their resilience and adaptability. In the south, stone houses anchored them to the earth. Further north, wood and clay framed their daily lives. Round or rectangular huts with conical straw roofs sheltered families around a central hearth, the heart of their existence. Wealthier Gauls boasted spacious houses, walls adorned with paintings and carpets. But as new ideas poured in from Greek colonies and Etruscan traders, Gallic society shifted, edging toward monarchy and permanent armies. Was this evolution a step toward greatness or a path to ruin? Yet, just as the Gauls began molding states from tribes and strengthening their economies with bustling towns, an unstoppable force surged forward. Long before Julius Caesar led Roman legions onto their soil, the Gauls had crossed swords with Rome itself. In the 4th century before our era, under the fierce leadership of Brennus, they stormed and sacked Rome, shattering its armies and pride. This brutal humiliation planted a seed of terror in Rome's heart, a fear that would fester for generations. How would this ancient wound fuel the clash to come? By the middle of the 2nd century before our era, Rome controlled vast territories, edging closer to Gaul. The stage was set for a collision not just of armies, but of worlds, where every decision, every sacrifice would ripple through history. The Gauls faced a choice: resist and risk annihilation, or submit and lose their identity forever. Their fate hung precariously on the edge of a blade, the consequences irreversible. This is the story of a people caught between innovation and invasion, faith and fear, freedom and domination. The Gauls' legacy survives in the artifacts and echoes of their struggles, a testament to the haunting power of irreversible choices. What lessons lie buried beneath the soil in the centuries? Only those willing to listen can hear the silent roar of history. Follow Quiet History to uncover the next chapter in this epic saga, the rise of Rome and the fall of the Gauls. The story is far from over, and every moment counts. Will the Gauls rewrite their destiny, or be erased by the march of empire? What does it take for a society to lose its soul? When the ancient Gallic tribes looked at the encroaching Roman Empire, did they see opportunity or annihilation? Gallia, rich in fertile lands and minerals, was far more than a prize for Rome. It was a pivot point between old ways and irreversible change. Rome's conquest was not just about possession, but about creating a buffer, a shield against the relentless Germanic tribes lurking beyond. But what price would the Gauls pay for this fragile protection? The transformation was neither swift nor uniform. In southern Gallia, where Roman influence had already seeped through trade and diplomacy, adaptation came quickly, almost eagerly. But the heartlands and the cold, resistant north clung to their Celtic traditions, as if their very identity depended on it. Still, by the dawn of the 1st century, the Gallic aristocracy, those once proud druids and chieftains, had begun speaking Latin, donning togas, and engaging in Roman religious rites. How far could they bend before breaking? This gradual Romanization brought new technologies, crops, and governance that forever altered the Gallic way of life. Cities rose like phoenixes from old Gaulish villages, forums, baths, amphitheaters, and temples built in the image of Rome itself. Roads carved through the landscape, connecting disparate parts of the province, weaving a network of control and exchange. But beneath this veneer of progress, could the native spirit survive the tide of conquest? Rural estates transformed into sprawling villas, centers of agricultural innovation that fed the empire's hunger. Gallia's economy flourished, exporting wine, olive oil, ceramics, glass, metal goods, textiles, and the famed garum, fish sauce that flavored every Roman feast. Gallic artisans, once isolated, now crafted bronze figurines, silverware, and iron tools coveted throughout the empire. Their woolen textiles and the iconic birrus cloaks were so prized that even emperors adorned themselves with them. Yet, was this prosperity a bond or a chain? The spiritual fabric of Gaul unraveled next. Druids, once untouchable as guardians of Celtic culture, found their power waning. Under Emperor Augustus, their rights were curtailed. Claudius decreed their outright ban. Roman gods supplanted native deities, yet in a haunting twist, local gods merged with Roman counterparts. Teutates became Mars. Isis took on Mercury's guise. Tyrannus was recast as Jupiter. The ancient faiths faded, replaced by rituals foreign yet strangely familiar. What did this spiritual conquest cost the Gallic soul? Among these new cults, the Eastern mystery of Mithraism gained a fierce following. Warriors and merchants drawn by its secret hierarchies, initiations, and promises of salvation. In subterranean Mithraea, hidden from the uninitiated, shadowy ceremonies unfolded, binding men to a destiny beyond the mortal coil. Meanwhile, the tides of change surged forward relentlessly, sweeping aside old gods and old powers alike. As the 3rd century dawned, a new force emerged: Christianity. It took root first in bustling urban centers, Lugdunum, Massilia, Lutetia, offering hope and belonging to craftsmen, traders, slaves, and slowly the elite. Despite brutal persecutions, the number of believers swelled, each martyrdom a grim testament to faith's stubborn flame. By the time Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity in the 4th century, it had woven itself deeply into Gallic society, reshaping identity once more. Could an empire once pagan truly transform so utterly? Politically, Gallia was carved into several provinces, each ruled by imperial governors who wielded absolute power. Cities earned municipal or colonial status, glimpses of autonomy in a system designed for control. Local councils, composed of affluent landowners and merchants, bore the heavy burden of funding public works, festivals, and games, efforts to maintain civic pride amid upheaval. The stakes were colossal. Who would rise? Who would fall in this struggle for dominance? By the early 3rd century, many Gauls had gained Roman citizenship, a privilege once exclusive, now widespread. Then in 212, Emperor Caracalla issued his sweeping edict: citizenship granted to all free inhabitants of the empire. This radical act erased old boundaries, binding Gauls and Romans under the same law, the same obligations. But what did this unity mean for centuries of Gallic identity? A proud people on the brink of losing themselves, or reborn as heirs to an empire that was no longer theirs. Gallia's story is a tapestry of fateful decisions and their irreversible echoes. Choices made in fear, ambition, and survival. Each step toward Romanization was a fork in the road, and each turn carried consequences that shaped not only a province, but the very soul of a civilization. The question lingers: when does assimilation become erasure? And when does the price of peace become the loss of who you are? Subscribe to Quiet History to unravel more tales of human fear, monumental decisions, and the devastating consequences that echo through time. What does it mean to be loyal when the very empire you serve begins to crumble? How far can identity stretch before it breaks? The once mighty Roman provinces began to twist under the weight of their own contradictions, and nowhere was this more dramatic than in Gaul. Gallic elites weren't mere subjects. They stood shoulder to shoulder with Romans, serving in legions, holding office, protected by Roman law. Some even rose to imperial heights, like Antoninus Pius, whose family hailed from Nemausus, modern Nîmes. But as the 3rd century crisis engulfed Rome, even Gaul could not escape the storm's fury. The Gallic Empire, from 259 to 273, carved out a realm spanning Gaul, Britain, and parts of Spain. Its founder, Postumus, was no mere rebel, a brilliant general who repelled Germanic raids and restored order along shifting frontiers. Yet his reign sparked a deadly chain of usurpations and assassinations. After Postumus's murder in 268, a carousel of rulers spun the Gallic Empire toward collapse, until Emperor Aurelian returned the territories to Rome in 273. This was not merely a political conquest. It was a reckoning of identities. Gaul no longer saw itself as a mere province, but as a power demanding recognition and autonomy. Yet even the reforms of Diocletian and Constantine, aimed at stabilizing the empire in the late 3rd and early 4th centuries, were quicksand beneath Roman feet. Taxes soared, corrupt officials bled provinces dry, and urban life decayed. Wealthy landowners abandoned crumbling cities for fortified rural villas, retreating into economic self-sufficiency and distancing themselves from imperial control. The barbarian shadow lengthened. In the 4th century, waves of Germanic tribes, the Franks, Alemanni, Burgundians, battered the empire's fragile borders. Roman legions, now largely composed of barbarian mercenaries, barely held the line. The empire's response was ruthless pragmatism. Pit tribes against each other, bribe enemies with gold, or recruit them as federates, defenders bound by uneasy alliances. By 394, the empire's division into east and west sealed Gaul's fate within the western half, with Ravenna as its capital. Power in Rome slipped away into the hands of military strongmen, many of barbarian descent. Stilicho, one such commander, famously repelled Alaric's Visigoths, but his subsequent execution on charges of treason ripped the empire's fragile defenses to shreds. 406 marked the dark turning point. A deluge of barbarians, Vandals, Suebi, Alans, broke through the Rhine. Gaul's cities were looted, countryside ravaged, Roman administration shattered. This was no fleeting invasion. It was a relentless flood that reshaped the very order of the West. Visigoths claimed Aquitaine, Burgundians settled the Rhone Valley, and the Franks steadily expanded their northern grip. The Western Roman Empire was gasping its last breaths. Puppets on the imperial throne replaced one another, while generals fought for scraps of power. The prosperity Gaul once knew was reduced to a memory buried beneath ruins and bloodshed. When Romulus Augustulus was deposed in 476, the Western Empire ceased to exist. Yet Gaul was no longer Rome's heart, but a fractured land dominated by Germanic kingdoms. Only pockets in the northwest clung to vestiges of Gallic Roman nobility, nominally loyal to the Eastern Empire. Here ended the Roman chapter in the story of France, an age lost to war, fear, and irrevocable choices. Amidst the collapse, one final violent act echoed: the shattering of Syagrius, the last Roman ruler of Gaul, who fell when his lands between the Loire and Seine rivers were seized by the rising tide of barbarian power. What remains is a haunting testament to the fragility of empires, the weight of identity, and the human cost of history's relentless turning. Will you join Quiet History to uncover more stories where decisions changed the world forever? Subscribe and dive into the past with us. What if a single battlefield promise could change the destiny of an entire kingdom? What if a king's choice to embrace a forbidden faith would alter the course of European history forever? Clovis, leader of the Franks, faced exactly that moment of reckoning around the year 496. His army was faltering against the Alemanni, retreating under pressure. In that desperate hour, Clovis called upon the god of his Christian wife, Clotilda, vowing to convert if victory came. The tide of battle shifted miraculously. Was it divine intervention or sheer will? This was no ordinary triumph. It was the birth of a new era. The aftermath was even more profound. Clovis's baptism by Bishop Remigius in Rheims was a spectacle marked by legend. A dove descending from the heavens, carrying a sacred vial of holy oil. This holy ampulla would be used for the coronation of French kings for centuries to come. But this act was far from mere ceremony. By embracing Orthodox Nicene Christianity, Clovis rejected the Arian faith common among other Germanic tribes, aligning himself with the Roman Church and its powerful Gallic aristocracy. His decision rippled beyond religion. It was a strategic masterstroke that secured the loyalty of key allies and recognition from the Eastern Roman Emperor Anastasius, who granted him the prestigious title of consul. The stakes were monumental. With one baptism, Clovis transformed from barbarian warlord into a legitimate ruler within the remnants of Roman civilization. Yet power never comes without sacrifice. Clovis's consolidation of authority was ruthless and calculated. Victories over the Alemanni, the Thuringians, and other Germanic tribes expanded his realm, but each conquest demanded brutal choices that reshaped societies. By 507, at the Battle of Vouillé, he crushed the Visigoths and seized Aquitaine, forcing their retreat into Spain. His grip on Gaul tightened, yet certain regions, Burgundy and Provence under Ostrogothic control, remained beyond his reach. The crown he forged was vast but fractured, its edges sharp with ongoing conflict and uncertainty. Within this storm of war and power struggles, Clovis laid down foundations that would echo through centuries: the Salic Law. Written in Latin, but raw and primal compared to Roman codes, this legal corpus enforced order amidst chaos. It defined punishments, assigned monetary compensations, and shaped the social fabric of Frankish society. These laws were a stark reminder that every decision carried weight, every verdict a finality that could not be undone. The law was both shield and sword, the promise of stability, yet also the guarantee of harsh justice. When Clovis died in 511, his kingdom did not pass intact to a single heir. Instead, it was divided among his 4 sons, fracturing the realm along fragile lines. Expansion continued. Burgundy and Provence fell, campaigns pushed into Spain and Germany, but unity was fleeting. Rivalries within the royal family sparked waves of internecine warfare, weakening the Frankish state against external threats. The question loomed: could a kingdom born of conquest survive its own internal divisions? Amid this turbulence, a fusion of cultures unfolded. The Frankish conquerors absorbed Roman administrative practices, legal traditions, and architectural styles, while the Gallic Roman elite adapted to these new rulers. Latin remained the language of church and state, but on the streets, evolving dialects whispered of a future French tongue. Monasteries blossomed as beacons of knowledge and innovation. Scribes painstakingly copied ancient texts, monks preserved the fading light of classical education, and agricultural advances spread from their cloisters. The kingdom was not only a battlefield, but a crucible of transformation. Yet, as the 7th century dawned, the Merovingian king's grip weakened. The kingdoms of Neustria, Austrasia, and Burgundy spiraled into near-constant strife. The real power slipped into the hands of the mayor of the palace, major domos who controlled the royal household and vast estates. In Austrasia, this role became the stronghold of the Pippinid family, setting the stage for a new dynasty to rise from the shadows of Merovingian decline. The question was no longer who ruled by divine right, but who could wield the power to shape the future. This was more than history. It was a relentless chain of fateful decisions, each one a pivot point between survival and collapse, faith and politics, unity and division. Clovis's baptism was not just a spiritual milestone, but the first step in a long, turbulent journey that forged medieval Europe itself. Who would dare to break the cycle? If you found this journey through the shadows of power and faith compelling, subscribe to Quiet History. Together, we'll continue uncovering the moments when history's deepest tensions ignited the future. What if the very foundations of power were built not on crowns, but on iron fists? What if a single battle could alter the fate of an entire continent? In 687, Pippin of Herstal, the mayor of the palace in Austrasia, shattered the Neustrian forces at the Battle of Tertry. This decisive blow did more than win a war. It forged a new era, where the Merovingian kings were reduced to mere figureheads, and real power passed into the hands of the mayors. But what dangers lurked in this shift of authority? The stage was set for a struggle between legacy and ambition. Pippin's son, Charles Martel, inherited not only his father's title, but his relentless drive. He revolutionized the Frankish military by crafting a formidable heavy cavalry, the backbone of Frankish dominance for centuries. Yet this military innovation did more than strengthen armies. It ignited the birth of a new warrior class, knights sworn to defend, but also to wield unprecedented power. As Charles faced the greatest threat of his time, would his reforms be enough to halt the tide of conquest? In 732, at the Battle of Poitiers, Charles Martel confronted an advancing Muslim force that had swept across Spain and threatened to engulf the Frankish kingdom. The clash was brutal, and the stakes unimaginable. Victory here was not just a military success, it was a shield protecting Christendom itself from collapse. But every sword stroke echoed with the weight of faith and fear as the future of Europe trembled on the edge of a blade. Charles Martel's death did not end the story. It only passed the torch to his son, Pippin the Short. However, Pippin faced a daunting challenge: legitimacy. The Merovingian kings still sat on thrones, shadows of power and history. In 751, with the blessing of Pope Zachary, Pippin made a bold, irreversible move. He deposed the last Merovingian king, Childeric III, and claimed the crown for himself. But seizing power is only the beginning. Could Pippin secure it forever? To cement his rule, Pippin introduced a sacred ritual, the anointing of kings, performed first by Bishop Boniface of Mainz and later by Pope Stephen II. This ceremony echoed biblical traditions, cloaking his authority in divine sanction. The crown was no longer merely a symbol of earthly rule, but a holy mandate entwined with the Church's power. Yet this alliance would bind the fate of the Carolingians to forces both spiritual and political, creating a delicate, perilous balance. Pippin did not stop at securing his throne. His ambitions expanded to reshaping the very map of Gaul. He conquered Septimania, the last Visigothic holdout, and subdued Aquitaine, which had long sought independence. But his most consequential act rippled far beyond Frankish borders. By defending the papacy against the Lombards and establishing the Papal States through what became known as the Donation of Pippin, he intertwined the fortunes of the Frankish monarchy and the Roman Church in a bond fraught with promise and peril. When Pippin died in 768, his kingdom fractured between his sons, Charles and Carloman. But fate intervened swiftly. Carloman's death in 771 left Charles as the sole ruler. Now known as Charlemagne, he forged a vast empire that would illuminate the medieval world. Driven by an unyielding will, Charlemagne waged relentless campaigns, conquering the Saxons to the north, the Bavarians and Avars to the east, and the Lombards in Italy. Each conquest tightened his grip, but the shadows of resistance and rebellion loomed large. Yet not all of Charlemagne's wars ended in triumph. His campaigns against Muslim Spain faltered disastrously. In 778, during a retreat through the Pyrenees,
His rear guard was ambushed in the Roncesvalles Pass by Basque forces. This crushing defeat claimed the life of his nephew, Roland, a loss that would resonate through history as the legendary Song of Roland, immortalizing both heroism and tragedy. It was a stark reminder that even the mightiest fall, and that the tides of war are as unpredictable as they are brutal. By the end of his reign, Charlemagne ruled an empire stretching across what we now know as France, Germany, northern Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium, Switzerland, Austria, and parts of Spain. The largest realm in Western Europe since Rome's collapse. To govern this patchwork of lands, he devised a system of counties, each led by a count wielding judicial, administrative, and military power. But beneath this order simmered tensions, ethnic, cultural, linguistic, that would later rend the empire asunder. After Charlemagne's death, his empire fractured along the lines of his grandsons. Ludwig the German's realm laid the foundation for modern Germany, while Lothair's Middle Kingdom, stretching from the Netherlands to Italy, proved fragile and contested. The Treaty of Verdun in 843 codified these divisions, reflecting deep cultural and linguistic rifts that would fuel centuries of conflict between France and Germany. The decisions that forged an empire became the seeds of its unraveling. The story of the Carolingian dynasty is a relentless chain of fateful choices, each victory shadowed by loss, each alliance shadowed by betrayal, each crown worn with the weight of inevitable downfall. How did power shift from kings to mayors, from warriors to rulers, from earth to heaven? And in that endless dance, who truly held control, and who was forever lost to history? For more stories where history's greatest moments unfold through the choices that shaped our world, subscribe to Quiet History. What happens when a once mighty empire falls into fragments? How do languages, laws, and loyalties reshape a land plunged into chaos? At the heart of this turmoil lies the legacy of Charlemagne, a ruler whose empire stretched across Western Europe, but whose descendants struggled to hold it together. The West spoke Romance languages born from Latin, while the East clung to Germanic dialects, splitting not only tongues but entire ways of life. These linguistic divides foreshadowed a larger fracture in law, culture, and power, a schism destined to rewrite the fate of France and its neighbors. But could any ruler stitch together these unraveling threads before the darkness swallowed all? Amid this unraveling, the Carolingian grip in the west, Frankish kingdom was slipping fast. Raiders from the north, the ruthless Norsemen, along with the Hungarians and Saracens, surged like relentless storms, pillaging without mercy. The royal authority was impotent, unable to mount a defense against these ceaseless attacks. In desperation, local lords seized control, fortifying their lands, raising armies of knights loyal only to them. From this chaos, a new order emerged: feudalism, a fragile system built on personal bonds of loyalty and protection, binding peasants to the soil while fracturing any hope of centralized power. But could these scattered strongholds withstand the mounting peril, or would the kingdom dissolve into endless war? By the end of the 9th century, the Carolingians were shadows of their former selves. Their power was mostly ceremonial. Real control rested in the hands of a few powerful families: Dukes of France, Counts of Vermandois, Dukes of Burgundy, Counts of Flanders, all locked in bitter rivalries. Their constant conflicts sowed political instability and economic ruin. Cities like Paris, Rouen, Orléans, and Tours faced devastation at the hands of those Viking raiders, swift warriors in dragon-headed ships ascending rivers to loot towns and monasteries. Entire regions along the Seine and Loire were emptied, silent witnesses to a kingdom's unraveling. What desperate moves could halt this tide of destruction? In 1911, King Charles the Simple made a fateful bargain with the Viking chieftain Rollo. He ceded land at the Seine's mouth, what would become Normandy, in exchange for Rollo's baptism and fealty to the French crown. This gamble paid off. The Normans assimilated rapidly, adopting the language and customs of their new home. Normandy thrived, becoming a beacon of order amid the chaos. Yet the descendants of Rollo would cast a long, sometimes dark shadow, especially when William the Conqueror claimed the English throne in 1066. How would these Norman ambitions reshape not just France, but all of Europe? By the mid-10th century, Carolingian authority was barely a ghost, their lineage ending quietly with Louis the Sluggard's death in 987. The nobles convened, not just to mourn, but to choose a new king. Hugh Capet, Duke of France and Count of Paris. This moment marked the end of Carolingian rule and the dawn of the Capetian dynasty, which would reign until 1328. Yet Hugh's power was limited to a small domain around Paris and Orléans, the royal domain. The vast lands of dukes and counts remained beyond royal reach, possessed by magnates whose wealth and armies rivaled the crown. Could a king with so little land command the loyalty of such powerful vassals? The great feudal lords, dukes of Normandy, counts of Flanders, dukes of Aquitaine, held titles granted by the crown but acted as sovereign rulers. They minted coins, issued laws, and pursued their own foreign policies. The king, though weak in practice, retained a sacred and political edge, the royal title. To many, the Capetian monarch was God's anointed, supreme judge and protector of the church. This spiritual legitimacy was the glue holding a fractured kingdom together, a symbol of unity against the centrifugal forces of feudal ambition. Yet symbols alone would not secure power. How would Hugh and his heirs transform this fragile authority into a lasting dynasty? The first Capetians were cautious rulers, avoiding grand conquests. Instead, they focused on consolidating their small domain and carefully expanding influence over neighboring lands. They innovated political stability by crowning their heirs during their own lifetimes, a practice designed to prevent succession crises and civil war that had long plagued France. Each coronation was a statement. The monarchy would endure, despite its weaknesses. But beneath this fragile calm simmered tensions between crown and vassals, a powder keg waiting for the spark. Could the Capetians escape the fatal mistakes of their predecessors and forge a new France from the ruins of an empire? The answer would shape centuries to come, and the fate of a nation hanging by a thread. What if the survival of a dynasty depended on a relentless streak of luck and unyielding strategy? How did the Capetians manage to navigate 3 centuries without ever losing an adult male heir? For over 300 years, this remarkable demographic fortune became their shield, enabling the dynasty not only to hold the throne, but to steadily consolidate their power. Yet, behind this facade of stability lay decisions that would shape the fate of France for generations to come. Could the alliance with the Church be the secret weapon of the Capetian kings? The crown's close support of the Cluniac monastic reform aimed at purifying the church from feudal corruption, cemented a powerful partnership. Kings like Louis the Fat and Louis the Younger were not just rulers but devout patrons of religious institutions, their faith fueling political strength. But this alliance came at a cost. Every act of piety was also a calculated move to reinforce their claim as defenders of Christendom. And the stakes? Nothing less than the legitimacy of their reign. Enter Philip II, called Augustus, who ascended the throne in the year 1180. His reign would become a turning point in the annals of Capetian power. With the cunning of a master strategist and the fury of a seasoned warrior, Philip expanded the royal domain dramatically. He wrested Normandy, Maine, Anjou, Touraine, and parts of Poitou away from the Plantagenet kings, the English rulers whose vast territories in France threatened Capetian sovereignty. But it was the Battle of Bouvines in the year 1214 that crowned his triumph, where he crushed a coalition of enemies and emerged the undisputed powerhouse of Western Europe. How did Philip's victories translate into lasting power? He engineered sweeping administrative reforms, creating the Bali system, royal officials wielding judicial, fiscal, and administrative authority, laying the groundwork for a centralized state. Under his reign, Paris was fortified with imposing walls, and the iconic Louvre Castle was constructed. The city blossomed intellectually, with the University of Paris rising as Europe's foremost scholarly hub. Yet, beneath this grandeur lurked mounting tensions. Could the crown sustain this newfound wealth and influence without igniting rebellion? Philip's son Louis VIII ruled, but briefly, only 3 years. But his campaign to reclaim Aquitaine from English hands marked a relentless continuation of his father's vision. Yet Louis's sudden death in the year 1226 thrust the kingdom into uncertainty. His wife, Blanche of Castile, assumed regency for their young son, Louis IX, a boy destined for sainthood but first tested by a crucible of political turmoil. Would this fragile regency hold, or would the kingdom fracture under the weight of internal and external threats? Louis IX, later known as Saint Louis, would come to embody the apex of medieval French power. His reign from 1226 to 1270 saw France's economy swell and its culture reach dazzling new heights. Gothic cathedrals soared in Paris, Reims, Chartres, and Amiens, monuments to faith and ambition. Yet Louis's devout nature and legal reforms, which banned private wars among feudal lords and combated corruption through royal investigators called enquêtes, masked an underlying fragility. His justice was absolute, but did it sow seeds of resentment that would later erupt? Louis's crusading spirit drove him to lead 2 fateful expeditions. The 7th Crusade in 1248 descended into disaster. Louis was captured and ransomed at immense cost, a blow that rattled the prestige of the French crown. His 2nd crusade to Tunis in 1270 ended in tragedy with his death from dysentery. These sacred wars, meant to elevate his legacy, instead exposed the limits of piety against harsh realities. Was this the price of idealism in a world ruled by brutal power struggles? Behind the royal splendor, scandal brewed. The infamous Tour de Nesle affair shattered the facade of Capetian sanctity when all 3 daughters-in-law of Philip the Fair were accused of adultery, a scandal that echoed through the corridors of power and stained the dynasty's reputation. Following Philip's death, the throne passed to his sons, Louis X, Philip V, and Charles IV, each ruling briefly and failing to produce a male heir. This looming crisis set the stage for the dynasty's ultimate rupture. When the last of the brothers died in the year 1328, the direct Capetian line ended. What would become of the crown now that the thread of succession was severed? The kingdom stood on the precipice, teetering between inherited legacy and the volatile forces of ambition and claim. The decisions made in these shadowed moments would ignite conflicts that reshaped not just France, but all of Europe. The question remained, who would seize the throne amid the vacuum left behind? Subscribe to Quiet History to uncover how these irreversible choices and human fears propelled France into a new era of turmoil and transformation. What if a single dynastic decision could ignite decades of bloodshed? When the French crown shifted to Philip VI, a cousin from the Valois branch, it set off a chain reaction no one could have predicted. But this was no ordinary succession. Edward III of England, a grandson of Philip the Fair on his mother's side, claimed the French throne as his birthright. This claim, tangled with disputes over territories like Guyenne and Flanders, was the spark that ignited the 100 Years' War, a brutal conflict that would rage from 1337 to 1453. The stage was set, and Europe was about to be drenched in war. The first chapters of this war spelled disaster for France. The English longbowmen, wielding their deadly longbows, shattered the might of the French knightly cavalry at the battles of Crécy in 1346 and Poitiers in 1356. These defeats culminated in the capture of King John II, known as John the Good, plunging France into chaos. The Treaty of Brittany in 1360 forced France to cede vast territories to England and pay a massive ransom for its king. But the losses went beyond land and treasure. France's very soul was bruised, and the weight of war taxes sparked a political crisis that threatened to tear the kingdom apart. In Paris, the streets erupted under Etienne Marcel, a merchant leader who challenged royal authority. Meanwhile, the countryside boiled over with the Jacquerie, a peasant revolt that was crushed mercilessly by the nobility. These social upheavals collided with the Black Death between 1348 and 1350, which wiped out a third of France's population. The nation teetered on the edge of collapse, its future uncertain as fear and desperation took hold. Yet amidst the darkness, a glimmer of hope emerged when Charles V, known as Charles the Wise, ascended the throne in 1364. Charles V faced a broken kingdom. With cold determination, he restructured the army and restored financial stability, weaving order back into the frayed fabric of France. Under his commander, Bertrand de Guesclin, the French abandoned costly pitched battles, favoring a strategy of attrition and guerrilla warfare that slowly chipped away at English gains. By the time Charles V died in 1380, the English held only a few coastal cities. But no victory lasts forever. What came next would plunge France back into turmoil. Charles V's son, Charles VI, was haunted by madness, his mind fracturing under the pressures of kingship. His illness fractured the court itself, igniting a deadly feud between the Armagnacs, supporters of the Duke of Orleans, and the Burgundians, loyal to the Duke of Burgundy. This poisonous rivalry paralyzed the kingdom as England, under Henry V, seized the moment to renew its assault. The French suffered a devastating defeat at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, where the English longbows once again wreaked havoc.
The Treaty of Troyes in 1420 was a bitter blow. Charles VI disinherited his own son, the future Charles VII, and recognized Henry V of England as heir to the French throne, sealing the fate of the crown through Henry's marriage to the French Princess Catherine. When Charles VI died in 1422, northern France, including Paris, swore allegiance to the infant Henry VI of England. The South, however, remained loyal to the Dauphin Charles, who retreated to Bourges and was crowned in the castle of Meaux-sur-Yèvre, earning the grim title, the Bourges King. The kingdom was fractured, its future hanging by a thread. French armies crumbled, coffers emptied, and morale sank to all-time lows. The land was on the brink of despair when from the shadows of Domremy, a young peasant girl named Joan of Arc burst onto the scene in 1429. Claiming divine guidance, Joan convinced Charles VII and the skeptical theologians that she was sent by God to reclaim France's destiny and crown the rightful king. Her arrival was nothing short of a miracle, igniting a fire in the hearts of the weary French. Joan led the relief of the besieged city of Orleans, breaking the English stranglehold and winning a series of victories that turned the tide of war. With her by his side, Charles VII was crowned at Rheims, the ancient royal city, restoring hope and legitimacy to the faltering Valois dynasty. The psychological impact was monumental. France believed again, and its spirit was reborn. But even this beacon of hope would soon face darkness and betrayal. In 1430, tragedy struck. Joan's journey, marked by divine mission and human frailty, would soon descend into a grim fate that would echo through history. As the war raged on, the stakes only grew higher, and every decision bore the weight of a kingdom's survival. The story of France was far from over. It was a testament to the terrifying power of human choices and the irreversible consequences they unleash. If you want to dive deeper into the turning points that shaped Europe and hear more stories of courage and catastrophe, subscribe to Quiet History and join us on this journey through time. Who decides the fate of a nation? What price does courage demand when destiny is on the line? Joan of Arc was captured by the Burgundians near Compiègne, betrayed to the English, and condemned for heresy and witchcraft in a show trial in Rouen. On the 30th of May, 1431, she was burned at the stake, her life sacrificed in flames. But was her death the end, or the spark for something far greater? The war raged on, but the tide was beginning to turn. In the decades that followed Joan's martyrdom, the French resistance grew fiercer. By 1435, Duke Philip the Good of Burgundy broke ranks with the English, signing peace with Charles VII. This seismic shift weakened English hold on French lands. Just a year later, in 1436, Paris was returned to French control, a symbol of revival and hope. Yet the battle was far from over. The stakes only escalated as Charles embarked on a bold military reform, forming Europe's first standing army equipped with artillery, forever changing the face of warfare. Imagine the weight of irreversible choices. Charles VII's reforms and the shifting allegiances were not mere tactics, but blows that fractured centuries-old power structures. England, plagued by internal strife and fading resolve, saw its dominion crumble.
By 1453, English forces were driven from nearly all French territory, clinging only to the port of Calais. The 100 Years' War ended not with a treaty, but with an undeniable French victory that reshaped their national identity forever. What began as a dynastic dispute exploded into a national awakening. The war united French society across classes around the dream of a sovereign kingdom. Following the war, Charles VII and his son Louis XI tightened royal control, crushing rebellious nobles and expanding royal domains. The death of Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, in 1477 marked a turning point. Burgundy, once a rival, was absorbed into the crown's grasp, consolidating power like never before. Louis XI, known as the Universal Spider for his cunning and relentless political maneuvers, spun a web of influence that reached deep into France's fabric. Relying on the middle class and minor nobility, he built an efficient bureaucracy, sidelining the old feudal order. Under his watch, commerce and industry flourished. Silk and luxury goods thrived, taxation was reformed, and the postal system improved. France was transforming into a centralized state governed by law and order rather than personal loyalty. But power was never secure. Louis's successors, Charles VIII and Louis XII, launched the Italian Wars, a series of brutal campaigns from 1494 through 1559. Initially driven by dynastic claims over Naples and Milan, these wars morphed into a deadly struggle for European supremacy between France and the Habsburgs. No lasting French territories emerged, but the cultural impact was profound. Through contact with Italy's Renaissance city-states like Florence and Milan, France absorbed revolutionary ideas in art, architecture, and humanism. Italian architects and artists, including the great Leonardo da Vinci, found refuge in France during his final years. The face of French royal residences changed dramatically. Medieval castles became elegant Renaissance palaces, signaling a new era of sophistication and power. Under Francis I, reigning from 1515 to 1547, the French Renaissance blossomed. He founded the Collège de France, a beacon of learning and culture. But dark clouds loomed. The kingdom was fractured by religious conflict. Moderate Catholics, supported by Spain, clashed with Huguenots, who received aid from Protestant states like England and German principalities. Tensions erupted into violence after the assassination of Duke Henry of Guise on King Henry III's orders in 1588. The following year, Henry III himself was murdered by a Dominican friar. With his death, the Valois dynasty came to an end, and the throne passed to Henry of Navarre, a Bourbon and leader of the Huguenots. The kingdom stood on the edge of chaos. A brutal test of survival and identity awaited. What forces shaped France's destiny? Martyrdom, war, cunning rulers, or cultural rebirth? How did the choices of a few ripple into centuries of history? The story continues, but the echoes of these irreversible decisions linger in the very soul of France. If this journey into history moved you, subscribe to Quiet History for more stories that reveal the power of human courage and the weight of destiny. What happens when faith clashes with power, when a king's belief becomes a barrier to his reign? Henri of Navarre faced an impossible choice. His right to the throne was unquestionable, yet as a Protestant in a predominantly Catholic France, acceptance was out of reach. In 1593, Henri made a fateful decision that would alter the course of France's future. He converted to Catholicism, uttering the legendary words, "Paris is worth a mass." This was no mere change of heart. It was a calculated gamble, a bridge to unify a fractured nation. But could one man's conversion truly end centuries of bloodshed? The question lingered, what would follow this fragile peace?
Henri's conversion did not stand alone. It was swiftly backed by military victories against the Catholic League and Spanish forces, solidifying his grip on France. By 1598, Henri signed the Edict of Nantes, a revolutionary decree granting the Huguenots limited religious freedom and political rights. For the first time in decades, the relentless religious wars ceased. Yet beneath this fragile calm, tensions simmered. Could a divided people truly coexist? Henri's reign promised restoration and renewal, but the scars of conflict ran deep, threatening to reopen at any moment. From 1589 to 1610, Henri IV emerged as one of France's most beloved monarchs, his rule marked by a tireless effort to rebuild a nation shattered by war. He revitalized the economy, championed agriculture, crafts, and trade, and restructured the finances and military. Together with his minister Sully, he embarked on ambitious infrastructure projects, roads, canals, bridges. They introduced new crops like corn and potatoes, fostering innovation in silk farming and textiles. It was a renaissance of growth and stability. But behind these advances lurked a relentless external threat, the Habsburgs, whose dominance Henri sought to counterbalance on the European stage. Henri's foreign policy was ruthless and pragmatic. He forged anti-Spanish coalitions and lent support to Protestant princes in Germany, challenging Habsburg supremacy. But fate was cruel. In 1610, a fanatic named Ravaillac assassinated Henri, slashing the hope of sustained progress. Suddenly, France stood on the edge of chaos, with a child king, Louis XIII, ascending to a throne fraught with danger. The fragile peace Henri fought so hard to build teetered on collapse. Who would hold the reins of power in these uncertain times? The regency of Louis's mother, Marie de Medici, proved a period of weakness. Royal authority waned as aristocratic opposition resurged, threatening the fragile unity of the kingdom. France felt the tremors of instability as factions vied for control. But salvation came in the form of a towering figure, Cardinal Richelieu. From 1624 until his death in 1642, Richelieu wielded power behind the throne, determined to crush the nobility's resistance and cement absolute monarchy. His rule would redefine France's destiny, but at what cost? Richelieu's policy was unflinching. He suppressed noble dissent, curtailed Huguenot privileges, especially their military power, and centralized governance through royal intendant officials who wielded sweeping authority in the provinces. His vision transcended religion, embracing raison d'etat, the reason of state, placing national interest above faith. Ironically, despite being a cardinal, Richelieu championed Protestant forces during the devastating 30 Years' War to weaken the Catholic Habsburgs, France's greatest threat. This audacious anti-Habsburg crusade laid the groundwork for France's rise to European dominance. But his iron grip ignited new unrest. After Richelieu's death and that of Louis XIII in 1643, Cardinal Mazarin inherited the mantle. His regency under the young Louis XIV was marred by the Fronde,
a turbulent rebellion between 1648 and 1655. It was the last desperate bid by the nobility and parliaments to halt the relentless centralization of royal power. What began as resistance to financial reforms quickly spiraled into widespread insurrection involving the highest aristocrats. The kingdom convulsed in chaos. Could Mazarin's diplomatic skill and the weary support of middle-class and peasant factions restore order, or would France plunge into deeper anarchy? The Fronde left an indelible mark on the young Louis XIV. Witnessing the betrayal, violence, and factional greed, he grew to deeply mistrust the nobility. This trauma steeled his resolve to forge an unchallengeable monarchy. When Mazarin died in 1661, Louis declared he would rule alone, ushering in the era of classical French absolutism. But could one man hold all power without sparking rebellion anew? The stakes had never been higher. Louis XIV's reign, spanning 72 years, would become the pinnacle of monarchical power in France. He wove a system where every thread of authority converged in his hands. His transformation of Versailles, from a hunting lodge to a magnificent palace, became a symbol of his unmatched might and grandeur. But beneath the splendor lay the echoes of past turmoil, the ghosts of fragile peace, and the looming question, could absolute power truly secure a nation forever? The story of France's rise and the heavy price of choice had only just begun. If you want to uncover more hidden secrets and the raw truth behind history's greatest decisions, subscribe to Quiet History. What price does absolute power demand? How far can a king go before ambition becomes his undoing? Louis XIV, the Sun King, transformed France into the epicenter of political and cultural life. But at what cost? The nobility, once wild and independent, was tamed, forced to spend endless hours at court, entangled in elaborate ceremonies designed to distract them from plotting. Louis's grip tightened as he isolated his rivals, turning privilege into prison. Yet beneath this glittering surface, the stakes were rising dramatically. To govern a vast kingdom, Louis relied not on nobles, but on a loyal bureaucracy bred from the middle class, men who owed everything to his favor. Among them, three giants stood: Jean-Baptiste Colbert, the master of finance and commerce; François-Michel Le Tellier, Marquis de Louvois, the relentless reformer of the army; and Sébastien Leprestre de Vauban, the mastermind behind France's impregnable defenses. Each man wielded power that reshaped France's destiny, setting in motion forces that could neither be controlled nor reversed. Colbert's mercantilist vision was ruthless and sweeping. He strangled imports, especially luxury goods, to boost homegrown industries, fine fabrics, gobelins, glass, and porcelain. High tariffs protected French artisans, but the king demanded more. Roads, canals, ports. Colbert built infrastructure at a breakneck pace to fuel commerce and expand colonial trade across North America, the Caribbean, and India. Yet, behind these grand projects lurked the shadow of overextension. Could France's economy bear such strain without collapse? Meanwhile, Louvois turned the French army into a lethal instrument of royal will. Uniformity replaced aristocratic chaos. One standard-issue gear, rigorous officer training, streamlined logistics, and improved medical care made the army a national force, answerable only to the king. This was no ordinary military reform.
It was a declaration that the king's ambition would be enforced by steel and blood, and that no noble commander would stand in his way. The battlefield had become a stage for irreversible choices. Vauban, the military genius, forged the Iron Belt, a chain of fortresses shielding France's borders from invasion. His innovations in siege warfare allowed French forces to seize enemy fortresses with terrifying efficiency. This fortress network was both shield and sword, but it also signaled relentless conflict ahead. Louis's external ambitions ignited wars that would consume the continent in flames, and the fate of France would hang in the balance. Louis's military campaigns dominated Europe for decades. The Devolution War from 1667 to 1668, the Dutch War from 1672 to 1678, the War of the League of Augsburg from 1688 to 1697, and finally the War of Spanish Succession from 1701 to 1714. At first, victories brought vast territorial gains. Flanders, Franche-Comté, Alsace, Strasbourg, parts of Lorraine fell under French control. But these triumphs sparked fierce resistance, uniting England and Austria in coalitions determined to halt French dominance. The war for the Spanish throne was Louis's final gamble, the peak of his dreams and the abyss of his empire. The peace that ended it was a bitter compromise. His Bourbon line secured the Spanish crown, yet France emerged exhausted, bleeding resources, and losing its grip on European hegemony. Could a single man's ambition destroy a nation from within? Inside France, Louis's choices fractured society. The revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685 stripped the Huguenots of their religious and civil rights. 200,000 fled, skilled artisans, merchants, soldiers, depleting the nation's wealth and tarnishing its reputation abroad. The king's quest for religious unity unleashed economic and demographic wounds that would fester for generations. The king's lavish court and endless wars drained the treasury. Taxes soared, debt spiraled, and as famine and plague struck, France's future darkened. When Louis died, a fragile state remained, teetering on the edge of collapse, burdened by the irreversible consequences of decades of unyielding rule. After Louis's death, power shifted to the Duke of Orleans during the Regency from 1715 to 1723. Unlike the Sun King, he relinquished tight control over the nobility and revived the parliaments. Yet this period of relative freedom bred reckless financial experiments led by the Scotsman John Law. His paper money schemes and speculative companies sparked a fleeting boom, then a devastating crash that ripped through the fragile economy, foreshadowing the storms to come. When Louis XV came of age, hope flickered for France's renewal. At first, the young king showed interest in governance, guided by Cardinal Fleury, but the legacy of irreversible decisions, wars, exiles, debts, loomed large. The drama of power was far from over, as the kingdom stood at the crossroads between splendor and ruin, its fate shaped by the echoes of one man's relentless quest for glory. The Sun King's reign was a dazzling blaze, and a warning. When ambition swells beyond control, it consumes everything in its path. Will France rise from these ashes? Or will history remember Louis XIV as the architect of its undoing? If you want to uncover more stories of power, choices, and consequences that shaped our world, subscribe to Quiet History
and journey deeper into the past's most compelling dramas. What happens when a kingdom's heart begins to beat less for its people and more for its pleasures? When power slips quietly from the hands of a ruler to those wielding influence behind the scenes. From 1726 to 1743, Cardinal Fleury, the king's chief minister, held the reins of France with an iron grip, guiding the nation through a rare moment of stability and recovery. But after Fleury's death, the king's focus shifted away from governance towards hunting, lavish constructions, and fleeting romances. This gradual abdication of responsibility sent shockwaves through the corridors of power, setting the stage for a perilous transfer of control. Into this vacuum stepped powerful ministers and favorites, but none more influential than Madame de Pompadour, and later Madame du Barry. These women were not mere consorts. They became the real architects of France's fate, steering policies and shaping the court's intrigues. Behind the glittering salons and whispered conversations, the monarchy's fragile grip on power grew ever weaker. Yet the consequences of their influence would stretch far beyond the palace walls, pulling France into deadly conflicts and costly wars that would unravel its global standing. France plunged headlong into the War of the Austrian Succession, a brutal struggle from 1741 to 1748, followed by the even more devastating 7 Years' War from 1756 to 1763. These wars, fought across continents, left France bleeding on European battlegrounds and stripped it of most of its colonial empire in North America and India, territories ceded to Britain in humiliating defeat. The kingdom's global ambitions crumbled, while at home, the weight of these losses began to crush its spirit and coffers alike. Yet paradoxically, amid this turmoil, France's economy and population saw unprecedented growth. From around 20 million at the century's dawn, the population swelled to nearly 30 million by its close. Innovation in agriculture introduced new crops and techniques, fueling productivity on the land. Commerce blossomed, especially in the Caribbean colonies, where sugar, coffee, and indigo flowed into French markets. Still, these gains masked an underlying fragility, the seeds of economic strain that would soon threaten to explode. Industry surged forward, with textiles, metallurgy, and shipbuilding becoming pillars of this expanding economy. New production centers emerged, roads and canals stitched the country together, and communication improved. Paris, swelling to 600,000 souls by the century's end, crowned itself the largest city on the European continent, a bustling hub of crafts, trade, banking, and culture. Yet even as prosperity bloomed, the shadows of inequality and unrest lengthened, stirred by the currents of change sweeping through society's elite. At the heart of this upheaval was the intellectual revolution known as the Enlightenment. Philosophers like Voltaire, Montesquieu, Diderot, and Rousseau dared to question the foundations of monarchy, church, and social order. Their calls for reason, freedom, progress, and tolerance resonated deeply within the educated classes, seeding doubt and desire for change. The monumental Encyclopédie, published between 1751 and 1772 under Diderot and d'Alembert's guidance, sought to gather all human knowledge under the banner of Enlightenment rationality, challenging centuries of unquestioned tradition. Ideas spread rapidly, not just through books and journals, but through vibrant salons hosted by aristocratic and bourgeois women. These gatherings became crucibles of debate, where philosophers, writers, scientists, and artists mingled with nobles and citizens alike. This public sphere, later conceptualized by Jürgen Habermas, created a space where old certainties were dismantled and new visions of society took root. But such freedoms also fanned flames of dissent that would soon ignite into open rebellion. In the arts, the reign of Rococo brought a frivolous elegance marked by playful asymmetry, pastel colors, and intimate scenes of aristocratic pleasure. Think Antoine Watteau, François Boucher, Jean-Honoré Fragonard. Yet beneath this delicate veneer, a shift was underway. As archaeological discoveries in Pompeii and Herculaneum rekindled interest in classical antiquity, neoclassicism emerged, championing simplicity, restraint, and moral seriousness. Artists like Jacques-Louis David and architects such as Claude-Nicolas Ledoux and Jacques-Germain Soufflot crafted works embodying republican virtues and civic patriotism, ideals that would soon fuel the fires of revolution. France stood at a crossroads, caught between the fading glamour of a monarch's personal whims and the inexorable rise of new ideas demanding justice and reason. Each decision, each shift of influence, carried irreversible consequences. Would the old regime adapt, or would it crumble under the weight of its own contradictions? The answers lay just over the horizon as the 18th century marched relentlessly toward a cataclysm that would reshape the world forever. If this unfolding drama has gripped you, subscribe to Quiet History for more intricate stories of power, fear, and the fragile human choices that shape our destiny. What if the fate of a nation hinged on the weakness of a king? When Louis XV died in 1774, his grandson Louis XVI ascended the throne. A young monarch with good intentions but plagued by indecision and frailty. He sought to reform, calling upon enlightened ministers like Turgot, Malesherbes, and Necker to reshape France's broken system. But every effort to modernize taxes, liberalize the economy, and streamline governance met fierce resistance from privileged estates, grinding reforms to a halt. The stage was set for disaster, yet the worst was still to come. France's deepest wound was financial. The kingdom was drowning in debt, exacerbated by its costly support of the American Revolution. Driven by a desire to weaken Britain, Louis XVI gambled on aiding American colonists, winning moral satisfaction but plunging France into deeper fiscal chaos. Attempts to revive the treasury through new loans and heavier taxes only fueled unrest. By 1788, the crisis reached a breaking point, forcing the king to summon the Estates General, a representative assembly not convened since 1614. This seemingly pragmatic move unwittingly sparked a revolutionary wildfire. The Estates General was meant to solve financial woes, but instead it exposed fractures in French society. The Third Estate, representing over 95% of the population but holding only a third of the votes, demanded voting by head count rather than by estate. When their demands were ignored, deputies from the Third Estate, joined by sympathetic clergy and nobles, declared themselves the National Assembly. On June 20th, 1789, locked out of their meeting hall, they swore the tennis court oath, vowing not to disband until France had a constitution. A fateful moment of defiance, pushing the fragile monarchy closer to collapse. King Louis's attempt to dissolve this assembly backfired spectacularly,
igniting chaos in Paris. The people's fury erupted on July 14th with the storming of the Bastille, a fortress prison and symbol of royal tyranny. This violent act became the revolution's emblem, revealing a populace willing to take up arms to defend a new political order. Across the country, peasants revolted against feudal burdens while cities formed the National Guard under Marquis de Lafayette's command. The old regime was under siege, and nothing would ever be the same. On August 4, 1789, the National Assembly abolished feudal privileges, signaling the end of centuries-old social hierarchies. Less than a month later, on August 26th, they proclaimed the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, an audacious manifesto of freedom, equality, property, and resistance to oppression. The revolution accelerated, transforming France's institutions with radical reforms in administration, justice, and the church. By 1791, a new constitution turned France into a constitutional monarchy, with the king's powers curtailed and a legislative assembly elected by taxpayers rising in influence. Yet this moderate phase was fragile. The royal family's failed escape attempt in June 1791, the flight to Varennes, shattered trust and fueled revolutionary fervor. The king's arrest polarized the nation, and the new legislative assembly elected that autumn was far more radical. Jacobins, the revolution's left wing, surged to power, demanding a republic and pushing France toward war with Austria in April 1792. The country plunged deeper into turmoil, where ideological passions bred violence and uncertainty. The revolution's dark turn saw mass executions, as the guillotine became a grim symbol of justice and terror. Jacobins imposed sweeping social and economic reforms, price caps on essentials, universal conscription, and a campaign to erase the old church's influence. The Gregorian calendar was discarded for a revolutionary one, and the cult of the Supreme Being replaced Christianity. These radical measures, intended to forge a new society, only intensified the frenzy and the abyss into which France was hurtling. Each decision, each gamble by Louis XVI and his government carried irreversible consequences. The king's weakness invited chaos. Reforms clashed with entrenched privilege. Revolution burned through old order to ashes. The question remains, could France's fate have been any different? Or was this cascade of choices leading inevitably to rupture, bloodshed, and the rebirth of a nation in unimaginable ways? Subscribe to Quiet History to explore the human drama behind history's turning points, where every choice echoes through time, shaping the world we know today. What does it take for a society to survive the crushing weight of war and rebellion? How far can leaders push a nation before the people snap? France, in the throes of revolution, answered these questions with decisions that shaped its destiny and sealed the fate of many. Mobilizing every resource, forging a massive army, the French repelled external enemies and crushed internal revolts. But the cost was immense, and the threat outside faded by the summer of 1794. Yet, was peace truly within reach, or was France merely holding its breath before the storm inside exploded? Inside the Jacobin faction, cracks deepened, fed by the growing unpopularity of terror and economic controls that stifled everyday life. Fear morphed into resentment, and resentment into desperation. On the 9th of Thermidor, the 27th of July, 1794,
The convention witnessed a sudden, brutal upheaval. Maximilien Robespierre and his closest allies were arrested, once the architects of terror, now its victims. The next day, the guillotine claimed them, ending an era soaked in blood. But did the fall of Robespierre guarantee salvation, or merely open the door to chaos? The Thermidorian regime rose from the ashes of terror, discarding extreme economic regulation and mass executions. A fragile calm returned, with promises of moderation and stability. In 1795, a new constitution laid the foundation for governance based on property qualifications. Legislative power split between the Council of 500 and the Council of Elders, while executive authority was entrusted to a 5-member directory. Yet beneath this veneer of order lurked a fragile system, teetering on the edge of collapse. How long could it hold against mounting pressures? The Directory's rule from 1795 to 1799 was a tempest of instability, corruption, and economic hardship. Political factions clawed for dominance, royalists hungry to restore the monarchy, neo-Jacobins desperate to revive revolutionary fervor. The government, caught in this crossfire, often resorted to military force to maintain its grip. The army, once a tool of the revolution, grew into a decisive power broker. Among its rising stars was Napoleon Bonaparte, a Corsican whose meteoric military genius threatened to redefine France's future. But was his ascent a beacon of hope, or the harbinger of yet another upheaval? Napoleon's brilliance electrified the nation with stunning victories in the Italian campaign of 1796 to 1797. His Egyptian expedition, launched soon after, injected new energy and ambition into his legend. Each triumph was more than a military conquest. It was a stepping stone toward unimaginable power. Yet behind every victory lay a web of irreversible choices, a tense gamble with fate. Was France on the brink of salvation or submission to a new form of rule? The revolution's volatile waves had not yet broken. They were about to crash with unprecedented force. What drives a man to rise again after crushing defeat? How far will ambition push one to defy fate itself? Napoleon Bonaparte, once the unstoppable emperor, faced the darkest hours of his reign after the Battle of Leipzig in October of 1813. His forces shattered, his empire crumbling. The question was no longer if he would fall, but how far he would fall, and if he could ever rise again. The coalition armies surged into France at the dawn of 1814, overwhelming the battered French defenses. Napoleon, commanding a fraction of his former might, executed brilliant maneuvers, slipping through enemy lines with the cunning of a cornered wolf. Yet, despite his tactical genius, the relentless tide of Allied forces pressed ever closer to Paris. The capital's fall was inevitable. On the 31st of March, 1814, Paris capitulated. The city that had been the heart of Napoleon's empire now lay vulnerable, its fate sealed. Just days later, on the 6th of April, Napoleon faced the ultimate decision. He abdicated the throne. The man who had reshaped Europe surrendered his crown, a moment heavy with irreversible consequence. Exiled to the tiny island of Elba off the coast of Italy, Napoleon retained the title of emperor, but his world had shrunk to a prison. Meanwhile, back in France, the Bourbon monarchy was restored under Louis XVIII, brother to the guillotined Louis XVI. This new king promised constitutional freedoms, attempting to balance old royal power with revolutionary change. But beneath the surface, discontent simmered. Who truly holds power, the crown or the people? Veterans of Napoleon's wars and those who had gained lands confiscated during the Revolution felt betrayed by the Restoration. Their loyalty fractured, their hopes dashed. The fragile peace was but a veneer, hiding a nation on the brink of upheaval. Seizing this unrest, Napoleon escaped Elba in February of 1815. His return to France was nothing short of a triumphal march. Troops sent to stop him defected instead, swelling his ranks as he advanced toward Paris. The old king fled to Belgium, powerless to stop the storm gathering once more. The period known as the 100 Days began with Napoleon's dramatic return to power on the 20th of March, 1815. Attempting to present himself as a more liberal ruler, he enacted reforms to expand representative institutions. But the great powers of Europe, gathered at the Congress of Vienna, refused to accept his comeback. War was inevitable. On the 18th of June, 1815, the fate of Europe was decided on the fields of Waterloo. The Anglo-Dutch forces under Wellington, joined by Prussian troops led by Blücher, delivered a crushing blow to Napoleon's army. The emperor's final gamble had failed, sealing his doom and ending an era defined by ambition, fear, and irreversible choices. The echoes of these decisions still reverberate through history, reminders of how power can rise and fall, how human fear and hope collide in moments that shape the world forever. If you want to dive deeper into the twists and turns of history's most dramatic moments, subscribe to Quiet History and join us on this journey through time. What happens when one man's ambition reshapes an entire continent? When Napoleon Bonaparte finally renounced his throne, exiled to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, he took with him the fate of an empire and left behind a fractured Europe drowning in uncertainty. His death in 1821 marked not just the end of a life, but the close of one of the most turbulent and transformative chapters in French history. Yet this ending was only the beginning of questions about power, freedom, and the cost of revolution. How far would a nation go to redefine itself, and at what price? In just 25 years, France tore down the old world of absolute monarchy, spun through revolution and republic, crowned an empire, and then returned to a constitutional monarchy. The country was a boiling cauldron of change, its political, social, and economic structures shattered and remade under the pressure of relentless upheaval. This whirlwind era delivered profound shifts whose ripples stretched far beyond French borders, shaking the foundations of Europe itself. But as the dust settled, the question loomed: had France truly escaped its past, or was it trapped in a cycle of irreversible choices? The revolutionary ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity were not mere slogans. They were seeds of a new social order. Feudal privileges and class barriers were torn down, replaced by principles of civil equality and individual rights. The rise of a rational administrative system, secular civil law, and a national army based on meritocracy promised a modern state. Yet,
beneath this promise lurked darker shadows. Political violence erupted into terror, and the iron grip of Napoleon's authoritarian regime cast a chilling precedent of dictatorship. How would a nation reconcile these bright ideals with the blood they shed to achieve them? War after war drained France's lifeblood. Millions of lives consumed, resources exhausted, the continent plunged into relentless conflict. The Napoleonic campaigns, while showcasing military genius, left deep scars, physical, emotional, and political, that could not be healed overnight. France's rise to imperial dominance came at the cost of relentless suffering, and the question remains, was it destiny or disaster that shaped the nation's fate? Could a country so battered by war rise again, or would it forever bear the weight of its choices? Napoleon's legacy is a paradox. On one hand, he was a visionary reformer whose influence forged the framework of the modern French state. On the other, his reign exposed the dangers of unchecked power and war-driven ambition. The ideals of the Revolution and the image of Napoleon as a brilliant commander and reformer have inspired generations. Yet his era also forced Europe to confront the limits of authority, the balance between freedom and order, and the meaning of national identity and citizenship. These questions did not fade with his exile. They echo into our present day. France, after the Napoleonic Wars, was no longer the dominant power it had been under Louis XIV or Napoleon himself. But it remained a great power, rich in culture, economic strength, and international influence. The French language continued to be the lingua franca of diplomacy and intellectual elites. French literature, art, and science held their place at the forefront of European culture. Yet beneath this veneer of greatness lay the unresolved tensions of a nation struggling to define itself amid the ruins of its revolutionary past. This saga, from the ancient Gauls to the fall of Napoleon, is a complex tapestry of war, revolution, triumph, and defeat. It is a story of kings and peasants, philosophers and soldiers, saints and rebels, whose decisions shape the France we know today. Every choice carried irreversible consequences. Every victory concealed a new challenge. The past is never truly past. It is a living force, haunting and shaping the present. What new stories will emerge from these shadows? What lessons remain to be learned? Join us at Quiet History as we continue to explore these dramatic turning points. Subscribe, leave your thoughts, and become part of the story that still defines the struggle between power and freedom.